Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the faint crackle of a fire nearby, the soft hum of a distant wind, and a story from the past slowly unfolding in the calm of the night. Tonight, as the world around you grows still, we'll drift through the quiet chapter that came after the storms of Napoleon's life, the calm that followed years of thunder, glory, and defeat. You may begin to feel your body relax, your mind soften, and a gentle drowsiness washing over you as the warmth of this story settles in. Wherever you are listening from tonight, what country are you in? And what time is it there, I wonder? Before we go further, if you enjoy peaceful stories that help you unwind, you can gently tap the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It helps this calm little corner of history continue to grow, one sleepy story at a time. Let's begin our quiet journey back to the year 1815, a time when Europe was heavy with silence after years of battle. The cannons had gone still. The drums had stopped. And for the first time in decades, the man once known as Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte found himself surrounded not by soldiers, but by sea and sky. The waves of the Atlantic stretched endlessly before him, rolling and whispering softly against the shores of a faraway island. The air there carried no sound of war, only the rhythm of water and the rustle of grass. It was the kind of silence that felt both peaceful and haunting. Napoleon had known the noise of power. He had heard crowds roar, soldiers march, and cities tremble. But now, all that noise had faded into memory. What remained was something else, a stillness so complete that it seemed to echo with every choice he had ever made. On the lonely island of Saint Helena, far from the continent that once feared and followed him, Napoleon lived his last years surrounded by the steady breath of the ocean. No more armies. No more councils or coronations. Just the endless wind, the salt of the sea, and his thoughts, constant, circling, and unescapable. If you're beginning to feel your shoulders drop and your breathing slow, that's good. Let the story move like the tide, gentle and unhurried. The same rhythm that rocked Napoleon's island nights now guides you into your own calm. He arrived there after his final defeat at Waterloo, a moment that ended an empire and began his solitude. The British, fearing another escape, sent him to the most remote place they could find, a green island in the middle of the South Atlantic, where clouds drifted low and time seemed slower than anywhere else on Earth. When Napoleon first stepped ashore, the soil was damp and heavy. He looked out over the hills, the grass bending under the wind, and said little. The horizon was vast, yet offered nowhere to go. For a man who once crossed nations, an island like this must have felt like the edge of the world. His new home was called Longwood House, though house might have been too kind a word. It was old, creaking, and damp with the island's moisture. The walls seemed to sigh with the wind, and the ceiling leaked when the rain pressed too hard. Yet it was here that Napoleon would spend the quiet remainder of his story. Each morning, he would rise before the sun, dress simply, and step outside to breathe the cool air. The grass shimmered with dew, and far beyond, the sea stretched without end. He often stood there in silence, his gaze drifting toward the east, toward France, though he could not see it. Perhaps he imagined its scent in the wind, faint and unreachable. In those early hours, there were no guards shouting, no messengers rushing in. Only the distant sound of waves and the occasional cry of seabirds. The empire he once ruled existed now only in his memories. Yet in the quiet, there was something strangely human, a kind of peace that no crown or command could ever give. Every so often, he would dictate his memories to those who followed him into exile, loyal companions who still called him emperor, though the title no longer mattered. His words became his army, marching across pages instead of battlefields. In the rhythm of his storytelling, perhaps he found a small comfort, the control of retelling his life, even as it slipped away. If your mind begins to wander, that's perfectly fine. Let the sound of my voice blend with the imagined firelight, flickering and soft. Let the ocean breeze of Saint Helena drift across your thoughts like a slow, steady lullaby. Napoleon's days on the island were simple, repetitive, and yet, that repetition brought its own strange pace. The man who once planned every movement of vast armies now planned only his walks, his readings, his tea at dusk. He no longer sought to conquer. He simply learned how to be still. Sometimes, when the island's wind grew too loud, he would sit quietly near the window, eyes half closed, listening to the rhythm of rain against glass. The world that once moved at his command now carried on without him. And in that gentle surrender, history itself began to exhale. If you're still awake, take another deep breath. Let it go slowly. You're doing well. The story, like the sea, will continue, calm, measured, patient. And somewhere, in that stillness, you may begin to drift into rest. As months turned into years, Napoleon began to measure time not in battles or victories, but in sunsets. Each evening brought the same soft glow over the island hills, the same sigh of wind against the grass. He would sit outside, sometimes alone, sometimes with one of his few companions, and watch the light fade until only the sea remained visible in the dimness. There was something almost peaceful about this new rhythm. The man who once tried to control all of Europe now had no control at all, except over his thoughts. He found small comfort in books, in letters from faraway places, and in the steady company of silence. The sea became his clock. Morning came with its shimmering blue, noon with the bright salt air, and night with the deep hum of waves. The ocean didn't remind him of defeat. It simply reminded him of life continuing, vast, patient, and quiet. If your eyes are beginning to grow heavy, that's all right. You're supposed to feel that way. This story moves at the same slow rhythm as the ocean surrounding Napoleon, steady, unhurried, and calm. Let the sound in your mind stretch and soften, just as he did when he let go of the world he once ruled. Napoleon still carried pride, though it was gentler now, a quiet reflection instead of the roaring confidence he once wore like armor. He sometimes spoke of his campaigns, not to boast, but to remember the days when his footsteps echoed through the streets of Paris or the frozen fields of Russia. Each memory was a candle briefly lit, flickering against the dark of his small room. His health began to fade. The dampness of the island crept into his bones, and his once strong voice grew slower, softer. But there was a strange kind of dignity in that fading, as though time itself had finally convinced him to rest. Some nights, the wind would rise suddenly, rattling the shutters and shaking the door. He would turn his head toward the sound and smile faintly. Once, that kind of noise might have meant battle. Now, it was only nature's breath, strong but harmless. His companions tended to him with quiet care. They brought him tea, they listened to his musings, and sometimes they simply sat nearby, saying nothing at all. There was peace in their silence, the kind of peace that words could never truly capture. If you notice your breathing slowing, stay with it. Feel the rhythm of this moment, the same rhythm that carried Napoleon through those last years of waiting. History can be soft when we let it. Even great empires can fade gently, like a candle burning low at the end of a long night. On some evenings, he would step outside just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sea shimmered gold for a few fleeting minutes, then turned a deep blue. He often stood there, unmoving, his gaze fixed far away, perhaps toward home, perhaps toward something only he could see. He no longer chased greatness. He no longer needed to be remembered. What mattered was the quiet itself, the small comforts of breath, of air, of warmth. It was, in a way, the first peace he had ever truly known. The people on the island had grown used to him. They would see him walking, slow and calm, dressed simply. He was no longer the man of grand gestures. He was simply another soul watching the sea, passing the hours like everyone else. And as his body weakened further, so did his attachment to the world he once ruled. His eyes grew distant, but not sad, just tired, like someone who had finally accepted rest after too many years of wakefulness. If you're drifting a little now, that's perfectly fine. Let the story blur slightly at the edges, the way memories blur with time. You are safe here, surrounded by quiet, as the waves of history roll gently on. In those final months, Napoleon spent more time by his window than anywhere else. He watched clouds form and dissolve over the sea, he listened to the faint rhythm of rain on the roof, and sometimes he would close his eyes and whisper a few words in his native tongue, not for glory, but for peace. When the nights grew longer and colder, the wind carried the same sound across the island, slow, constant, endless. And in that sound, there was something timeless, not victory, not loss, but simply the gentle truth that all things must rest. As you listen now, feel that same stillness settle around you. The story doesn't end with triumph or tragedy. It ends the way all quiet stories do, softly, like waves folding into the shore, like fire settling into embers, like a voice fading into sleep. You can let go now. The sea is calm. The night is deep. And somewhere, far beyond the sound of time, the echoes of history grow faint until only peace remains. Good night, traveler of history. Rest well beneath the weightless blanket of the past. The ocean stretched endlessly in every direction, a grey-blue horizon that swallowed all sense of distance. When Napoleon first arrived at Saint Helena, he stood at the edge of the deck and said nothing. The air was heavy with salt, and the waves rose and fell like a slow heartbeat beneath the ship. After years of marching across continents, he had reached a place that felt like the end of the world, quiet, isolated, and far from everything he once knew. The island itself was not large. Its cliffs were dark and jagged, its hills covered in thick, damp grass. Clouds often lingered above it, heavy with rain, and the wind carried the same tired whisper day after day. There were no cities here, no armies, no music of parades or victory. Only the calm rhythm of wind meeting sea, again and again, as if the earth itself wanted him to rest. As he stepped onto the rocky shore, the people who watched him seemed unsure whether to bow or to stare. He was no longer the ruler of France, no longer the emperor whose name had shaken the world. Now, he was a man under guard, watched by soldiers who spoke to him politely, but firmly. Even the sound of his boots on the wet stones seemed smaller than it once was. When he reached Longwood House, the place felt like a forgotten corner of the earth. The rooms were plain and often damp. The ceilings leaked when the rains came, and the floor creaked with every step. But there was still a desk, a bed, and a small garden outside where the wind brushed the grass in gentle waves. For a man who had known palaces, this small home must have felt unreal, almost like a dream he hadn't chosen. That first night, the island was silent. The sea below murmured softly, and the wind hummed against the shutters. Napoleon sat at his desk and opened a book he'd brought with him, though he hardly read it. Instead, he looked around the dimly lit room and whispered to himself, almost as if reminding his own heart that he was still alive. The guards outside shifted occasionally, their boots crunching against the gravel. Inside, the candle flickered, painting long shadows across the walls. Every movement, every breath, felt slower here. The world that once rushed around him had come to a stop, and time now moved only in quiet ripples. If you listen closely, you might imagine that sound, the slow crackle of the candle flame, the faint tapping of rain against the glass, and somewhere beyond, the whisper of the sea. It's a peaceful kind of sound, one that stretches into your own breathing, steady and low, like the rhythm of sleep. Napoleon began to adjust to this new rhythm. He woke early, before the sun rose, and walked outside with his coat drawn tight. The air was cool and thick with fog. Birds called faintly from the trees, and his boots left small marks in the damp earth. He would walk until the mist began to fade, then stop to watch the first streaks of sunlight touch the hills. At times, he would sit outside the house, near the edge of the small garden, and gaze toward the ocean. The view was limited. The land rose steeply, blocking most of the horizon. But on clear days, he could see a faint shimmer of water in the distance, and that seemed enough. It was proof that the world beyond still existed, even if it was no longer his to command. He started keeping notes, not of battles or politics, but of his daily thoughts. The island's weather, the sound of rain, the behavior of birds, even the shapes of clouds that drifted over the hills. These small details became his new world, replacing the endless decisions and orders that had once filled his mind. If your mind starts to quiet as you listen, that's good. Let it. The same stillness that filled Napoleon's days is meant to touch your own. The same wind that crossed the sea now moving softly through your imagination. Sometimes he would stand in front of the mirror, not in vanity, but curiosity. The face staring back at him was older now, marked by lines and fatigue. His eyes, once bright and calculating, had softened. He was no longer the man in uniform. He was simply a man, one whose power had vanished, yet whose memories still glowed faintly beneath the surface. The soldiers stationed nearby were respectful but distant. They guarded him because they had to, not because they hated him. Some were even kind in their way, offering small gestures of politeness or bringing him books from their own collections. Yet every kindness reminded him of what he had lost. Even freedom, he realized, could feel heavy when it was gone. And as the night deepened, he would finally sit, close his eyes, and let the soft hum of the island carry him into sleep, not as a ruler, not as an exile, but as a man listening to the heartbeat of the sea. Days began to blend together, like the soft waves that never truly ended. Morning followed night with quiet discipline, and each sunrise brought the same muted colors across the sky. Napoleon's schedule had no urgency now, no meetings, no armies waiting for orders. He spent hours at his desk, writing small notes that only he would ever read. Some were about his past, some about the weather, and others were nothing more than reflections, half-thoughts fading between memory and dream. The few companions who lived with him learned to match his quiet rhythm. They spoke softly, walked gently, and treated the silence as something precious. In the evenings, they would share a simple meal, sometimes discussing memories of France, sometimes saying nothing at all. The clink of a spoon or the sound of a sigh filled the gaps between words. The world outside their small home might have forgotten Napoleon, but within those walls, time still paused for him. Occasionally, visitors would arrive, officers from ships passing through, or curious officials from far-off places. They would bow respectfully, exchange a few words, and leave again, taking their stories back to the sea. To them, Napoleon was no longer a threat, just a living echo of history. And when their ships disappeared beyond the horizon, the island's stillness returned, unchanged and unbroken. The weather was both his companion and his enemy. Some days were bright and almost beautiful, the air cool and the wind soft. Other days were thick with rain, the walls damp and the light grey. The island's moods matched his own, unpredictable, weary, and yet still full of a strange, persistent life. He began to understand that the world didn't need to be conquered to be felt deeply. When the storms came, the sky turned black and the sea roared with a wild, relentless power. The house creaked under the pressure of the wind, and the windows shook. On those nights, Napoleon would sit near the fire, wrapped in his coat, watching the flames flicker. The storm outside reminded him of the chaos he once commanded. Armies in motion, orders shouted, nations trembling. But now, that chaos was only weather, harmless and distant. If you can imagine that sound, the rain, the wind, the slow breathing of the ocean, let it sink into you now. It's the sound of time stretching, the same rhythm that filled the long nights on Saint Helena, the same calm that surrounds you when you're halfway between waking and sleep. When the storms passed, the air turned clear and bright. He would step outside and feel the cool wind against his face. The sky, freshly washed, seemed infinite. For a moment, he would lift his chin and close his eyes, letting the sunlight fall across his face. It was a rare peace, one that didn't come from power or victory, but from surrendering to the simplicity of life itself. Over time, Napoleon began to speak less about his past. The memories were still there, sharp and alive, but they had softened around the edges. He no longer spoke as a conqueror or a strategist. He spoke as a man trying to understand what it all meant, the glory, the loss, the long years of ambition that had brought him to this quiet end. At night, he sometimes dreamed of movement, the sound of horses, the clash of metal, the cheers of soldiers. But when he woke, there was only the gentle hum of the island, the faint rustle of leaves, and the slow, steady rhythm of waves. It wasn't disappointment that filled him then, but an odd sense of calm. The world he dreamed of had passed, but the silence that replaced it was strangely kind. He had few possessions left. A few books, a handful of letters, a few pieces of uniform he refused to discard. These things, he realized, were no longer symbols of power, only small reminders of who he had been. Each object held a story, a fragment of his life that could be remembered quietly, without regret. If you're still awake, let your breathing match his, slow, steady, soft. The story, like the sea around Saint Helena, moves without hurry. There is no rush to reach the end. The meaning is found in the stillness between each wave. As the years slipped by, the island's guards changed. New faces arrived, old ones departed. To Napoleon, it hardly mattered. The rhythm of his days remained the same. Sometimes he would joke gently with his attendants. Sometimes he would drift into long silences that lasted for hours. The empire he once ruled had become nothing more than memory, and memory itself had turned into his last companion. He grew thinner, his steps slower, his handwriting shakier. Yet even as his strength faded, there was a softness in his presence, a calm acceptance that life, even in exile, still had meaning. Perhaps he understood that greatness isn't always measured in power, but in the way one faces solitude. And so, as the sun fell behind the island hills each evening, he would sit quietly by the window. The sea would glow with the last light of day, then fade into blue, then into black. Somewhere out there, the world continued, full of noise and ambition. But here, in this forgotten corner of the ocean, there was only peace. The waves would keep moving, the wind would keep whispering, and time would keep passing, gentle, endless, and sure. In that sound, Napoleon's story continued to breathe, not as a legend of war, but as a quiet lesson in surrender. If your eyes are growing heavy, let them close now. The sea is calm again. The island is silent. And the man who once moved empires is finally still, surrounded not by armies, but by the soft, endless rhythm of peace. Longwood House sat quietly on a hill, wrapped in mist and sea air. It wasn't grand or elegant. It leaned slightly with the wind, its windows often fogged from the island's humidity. Yet this small, weathered house became the center of Napoleon's remaining world. It stood between him and the endless ocean, between memory and the slow unraveling of time. The walls were thin and damp, carrying the scent of wood and salt. When the wind grew strong, the shutters rattled like old bones, and rain found its way through cracks in the roof. Still, it was home. A strange, reluctant home, one that echoed with quiet footsteps, the scratching of pens, and the faint sound of waves below the cliffs. Inside, the rooms were small but full of life's leftovers. A desk covered with papers, a chair worn smooth by hours of sitting, and a single candle that burned through long evenings. Napoleon arranged his belongings carefully, almost as if he was setting up a small version of his empire, neat, organized, and controlled. In a way, it was all he had left to command. Each morning, he would open the shutters and let the cold air drift in. Sometimes, clouds pressed so close to the windows that it felt like the sky itself was leaning into the room. He would stand there for a moment, hands behind his back, watching the mist shift and swirl. The outside world no longer belonged to him, but these quiet mornings did. The house had a strange kind of rhythm, the creak of floorboards, the ticking of a small clock, the muffled steps of servants passing through the hall. To someone else, it might have felt confining, but to Napoleon, the pattern of sounds was a kind of order, a reminder that even in isolation, life could still move in steady, predictable ways. He often sat at his writing desk, pen in hand, writing letters to those who remained loyal or curious about him. His words were deliberate, thoughtful, and often tinged with melancholy. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, staring out the window before continuing, as though he were writing not to others, but to time itself. When his health allowed, he walked through the gardens outside. They were small and rough, nothing like the manicured parks of Europe's palaces. The soil was uneven, the plants simple, mostly herbs, a few flowers that struggled against the salty wind. Yet he tended to them with surprising patience. Perhaps it gave him something to nurture in a life that had already lost so much. If you picture him there now, coat buttoned, hands clasped behind his back, moving slowly through the damp grass, it's easy to imagine the sound of his steps, steady and unhurried. The same rhythm that once echoed through marble halls now belonged to this lonely patch of green. Sometimes, The British officers stationed nearby would ride past the house. They were polite, though distant. Napoleon would nod to them, a small gesture that carried neither resentment nor pride. The war between them was long over, and what remained was only the quiet acknowledgement between men who had lived through too much. On quiet afternoons, he would take tea with his companions, a small circle of loyal followers who had chosen exile over comfort. The conversation was slow, the pauses long. They spoke of weather, of the island, sometimes of France. But often, silence filled the space between them, a silence that didn't need to be broken. The walls of Longwood carried that silence well. Each room seemed to hold the weight of memory, laughter, sighs, the scrape of chairs, the echo of distant thunder. And when the evenings grew darker, the candlelight softened the rough edges of everything, turning even the worn furniture into something gentle. If you're listening closely, imagine that light now, warm, flickering, casting long shadows across the walls. Let that image slow your breathing. The same stillness that filled Napoleon's nights can fill your room too, if you let it. He began keeping a small routine. Mornings for writing, afternoons for short walks, evenings for reading or conversation. It wasn't the schedule of a ruler, but of a man seeking balance in small things. The world outside might have forgotten him, but within these hours, he found a rhythm of peace that no crown had ever given him. Sometimes, he would lean over the desk, tracing the edge of a map with his finger. The map was old, its borders already outdated, but he studied it like one studies a memory, not to relive it, but to understand it. The empires and battles once marked in ink now existed only as faint ghosts beneath his touch. When rain returned, and it often did, it would drum gently against the roof, filling the house with a constant, calming sound. Napoleon would listen to it for hours, as though each drop carried a message from far away. Perhaps it reminded him of movement, of the sound of marching soldiers or the rhythm of drums. Or perhaps it reminded him that even the sky could be restless. He grew fond of those rainy nights. They softened the loneliness of the island, turning it into something almost sacred, a shared quiet between him and the world. The candlelight shimmered in the puddles outside, the air smelled of wet grass, and the sound of water on the roof lulled him into thought. When he finally went to bed, he would blow out the candle and let the darkness settle like a blanket. The house would creak softly, the wind pressing against the windows, and the sea would whisper far below. In that stillness, there was no throne, no battlefield, no empire, only a man, a room, and the long exhale of another day. As the months passed, Longwood House began to change with the seasons, though the island's weather rarely offered much variety. Some days brought soft sunlight that filtered through the curtains like gold dust, and on others, the fog wrapped the house in silence. Napoleon learned to recognize the moods of the air, when the wind would rise, when the rain would return, and when the world would be still enough to hear his own heartbeat. He started to take shorter walks, no longer to explore but simply to feel the wind on his face. The path behind the house led to a small rise overlooking the sea. From there, he could see the faint line where the water met the sky. On certain mornings, the horizon shimmered so brightly it looked like glass. He would stand there in silence, breathing slowly, as though trying to absorb the vastness in front of him. Inside, his companions kept the routine steady. They cleaned, cooked, and read aloud from his favorite books. The sound of pages turning filled the quiet like a soft metronome. Occasionally, laughter would drift through the halls, brief, gentle moments that reminded everyone that life, even here, could still be warm. Napoleon would smile faintly when he heard it, though he rarely joined in. He began to write less about politics and more about human nature, about ambition, loss, and time. The words came slower, and he often paused to think before finishing a sentence. His tone had softened. His once sharp judgments became reflections instead of declarations. He seemed to be speaking not to the world anymore, but to himself, or perhaps to the silence that surrounded him. At night, the candles would burn lower, and the walls glowed with amber light. The shadows moved gently across his desk, following the rhythm of the flame. He often worked until his eyes grew heavy, then sat back in his chair, letting the pen rest. The ink dried quietly while he drifted somewhere between thought and sleep. If you feel yourself slowing with him, let it happen. This is the calm between one breath and the next, the stillness that even an emperor must one day learn to keep. The story moves softly now, like wind through an old house. Some evenings, when the rain had stopped and the air turned cool, he would leave his chair and step outside. The garden glistened under the dim moonlight, droplets hanging on every leaf. He would walk without speaking, feeling the damp soil beneath his shoes, the scent of wet grass in the air. In those quiet moments, the world felt both vast and gentle, too large to rule, but kind enough to exist within. He sometimes spoke of his mother and his childhood in Corsica. The way the sun felt there, the smell of the sea, the narrow streets of his youth. Those memories softened his face, pulling him away from the heavy shadow of history. For a few minutes, the man in exile was simply a man remembering home. The British officers who watched him had grown used to his calm presence. They reported fewer incidents, fewer frustrations. The dangerous prisoner had become a quiet scholar, an old soul who preferred tea and reading to arguments and escape. Some of them even felt sympathy, though they would never admit it aloud. The island itself seemed to respond to his stillness. Birds began nesting closer to the house, and the garden grew thicker with green. Time moved differently here, slower, quieter, like the world had decided to breathe in and hold that breath. Every sound felt intentional, the rustle of trees, the scrape of boots, the sigh of waves below. He kept a few personal belongings on the small table by his bed, a watch, a few medals, and a miniature portrait of someone dear. He would glance at them before sleep, not with pride, but with a soft, lingering affection. The past, though distant, was still a companion that visited him nightly. As his health began to falter, he spent more time by the window. The light there was gentle, and he liked to watch how it changed from morning to dusk. The world outside remained the same: fog, wind, sea, yet within that sameness, he found something deeply human. The quiet repetition became a kind of prayer for peace, though no words were spoken. If you're still awake, notice how still your own breathing has become. The rhythm you hear is the same one that filled Longwood's nights, slow, peaceful, endless. History doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers in the dark, waiting for us to listen. One evening, as the wind rose again, Napoleon lit his last candle and sat for a long time without writing. The flame bent and swayed, reflected in his tired eyes. Perhaps he thought of France, perhaps of the ocean, or perhaps of nothing at all. The night outside hummed softly, and the island seemed to hold its breath. When he finally stood and walked toward his room, the house made its familiar creaks, the sound of wood settling, of air shifting. He placed his hand briefly on the wall, as if saying goodbye to something unseen. Then he closed the door behind him, leaving the candle to flicker one last time. The light in Longwood House dimmed, and the world grew quiet once more. The waves continued their slow rhythm, the wind brushed gently across the grass, and the island slept, holding within it the story of a man who had once ruled the world, now learning how to rest. If your eyes are closing now, let them. You've followed the story to its quiet edge. The sea still moves, the wind still hums, and Longwood still stands, old, patient, and at peace beneath the soft breath of history. By the time the years began to blur together, Napoleon had found something he had never truly known before, a routine that didn't demand power, or war, or victory. At Longwood House, every hour had its quiet purpose. The mornings were slow, the afternoons were steady, and the nights calm and predictable. The rhythm was small, but it was his. He woke at dawn, when the island was still grey and damp with fog. The light crept gently through the shutters, painting faint stripes across the wooden floor. For a few minutes, he would simply lie still, listening to the distant waves, to the occasional chirp of a bird, to the soft hum of the house settling into another day. Then, quietly, he rose. The first thing he always did was wash his face in cold water. It shocked him awake but reminded him he was still alive. The air of Saint Helena was cool, sometimes heavy with mist, and the scent of wet grass drifted through the small window. He would stand there for a moment, hands resting on the basin, breathing slowly, his reflections soft in the rippling surface. Breakfast was simple: bread, tea, perhaps fruit if the supply ships had arrived. He ate without hurry, often in silence, sometimes while reading a few pages from an old favorite. The table was plain, but always tidy. Order had become its own comfort, not the order of armies and governments, but the small kind that comes from control over one's own space. After breakfast, he walked the garden path. The ground was uneven, and the air smelled of salt and soil. He moved with purpose, though slowly, as if every step measured the length of a thought. The garden was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. Sometimes he would stop, crouch slightly, and adjust a small plant or brush dirt from a stone. These gestures, simple and repetitive, became his way of thinking, or perhaps of forgetting. The British sentries who watched the property had grown used to his walks. They would nod politely, and he would return the gesture with a faint smile. The tension that had once existed between them had faded into something almost human: mutual recognition, a silent truce between former enemies. After his walks, he returned indoors to write. The room was small, his desk cluttered with papers, quills, and notes. His handwriting had grown slower, his lines less sharp, but the mind behind them was still precise. He wrote of history, of strategy, of human behavior, not to plan the future, but to preserve the past. His memories had become his only battlefield. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it: the faint scratch of his pen against paper, the distant call of seabirds, the whisper of wind through the shutters. That was the sound of his empire now, not drums, not trumpets, not orders shouted across fields, but the soft rhythm of thought meeting ink. When the island sun climbed higher, he would close the shutters to cool the room. The air inside filled with the scent of paper and wood, faintly sweet from the humidity. He would sip tea while reviewing what he had written, occasionally crossing out a line and starting again. The past, once his weapon, had now become his companion, patient, unchanging, endlessly revisited. He no longer rushed through his work. Every sentence was deliberate, every pause meaningful. Sometimes he would stop entirely and look toward the window, letting his gaze wander to where the mist met the light. His eyes would grow distant, not with regret, but with an odd kind of peace, the peace that comes when ambition finally stops asking for more. If you're breathing slower now, stay with that rhythm. It's the same one that filled Longwood every morning, slow, steady, full of unspoken understanding. Even in exile, there can be balance. Even in silence, there can be grace. In the afternoons, Napoleon often changed into a lighter coat and met with his few companions. They would sit together, sometimes in the garden, sometimes by the fireplace, sharing small bits of conversation about the weather, letters from home, or the state of Europe, now distant, now abstract, like a story told in another language. Sometimes he would dictate to one of them, long stretches of memory, carefully detailed accounts of battles and diplomacy. His voice was steady, measured, as though recounting someone else's life. His assistants wrote quickly, but he never rushed them. Every name, every decision, every consequence, all recorded not to glorify, but to remember. When he grew tired of dictation, he would pause, lean back, and close his eyes. The others would wait in respectful silence, knowing these pauses were not interruptions, but part of the rhythm itself. The space between his words carried as much meaning as the sentences that followed. Occasionally, he would glance at the clock and smile faintly. Time, which once obeyed his command, now passed on its own terms. But he no longer fought it. Each hour that slipped away seemed to carry a quiet kindness, proof that life could still move, even without conquest. By late afternoon, the light outside softened into gold. The island shimmered faintly, and the sea reflected the color of the sky. Napoleon often watched this from the small veranda outside his room. He would rest his hand on the railing, feel the cool air brush against his face, and say nothing. The world didn't need his words anymore, and he seemed content with that. As evening approached, the scent of the ocean grew stronger. The sounds of the island, the chirp of insects, the distant murmur of waves, became a kind of music, simple and unbroken. He listened to it as one listens to an old song, remembering without holding on. Inside, the servants lit candles and prepared the evening meal. Shadows stretched across the walls, and the air took on the warm glow of amber light. Napoleon sat quietly, hands folded, as plates were placed before him. The conversation was gentle, often filled with long silences that no one felt the need to fill. If you picture the room now, dim, quiet, filled with flickering candlelight, let that image rest in your mind. This was not the world of crowns and battles. It was the world of small sounds, soft moments, and a heart finally learning to be still. And as the last light of day slipped beyond the hills, he would rise slowly, thanking his companions with a nod. The night awaited, calm, predictable, and mercifully silent. After dinner, Napoleon would sometimes remain seated, tracing the rim of his teacup with one finger, lost in thought. The others might speak softly nearby, their words blending with the sound of rain against the windows. He listened, though he rarely answered. The conversations of others had become like distant music, something to observe, not to join. When the rain stopped, he liked to walk the corridor once or twice before bed. The wooden floors creaked beneath his feet, and the candle he carried cast a small, trembling light ahead of him. The shadows danced along the walls, long and slow, as though they too were remembering something. Every night, the same walk, from one end of the house to the other, before returning to his room. His attendants would sometimes find him standing by the window instead of sleeping. The sky above Saint Helena was deep and endless, scattered with stars. He would rest his hands on the sill, eyes lifted toward the faint, distant light. For someone who had once redrawn the world's borders, this vast and unreachable sky must have felt humbling, a reminder that even great lives are small beneath creation. He no longer feared silence. In fact, he seemed to need it. The house could fall completely still for hours, and he would remain content, sitting, breathing, thinking. The silence was no longer an enemy. It had become a companion that spoke without words, a kind of peace that didn't ask for anything in return. At times, he reread the books he'd already memorized, stories of ancient rulers, explorers, philosophers. He underlined passages that spoke to him, though he never explained why. Some pages were worn thin from his touch. Perhaps he saw in those words reflections of his own life, ambition, pride, solitude, all the forces that had once driven him and now sat quietly beside him. If your body feels heavier now, let it. You are following the same slow rhythm that filled Longwood each night. The same softness that surrounded Napoleon's evenings now begins to settle around you too. Before sleeping, he often dictated a few final lines, part of his memoirs, or perhaps a thought that had been turning in his mind all day. His voice was lower now, and his pace slower. He spoke not as an emperor, but as an observer of his own story, detached and gentle. His words no longer tried to prove anything. They simply existed, like ripples fading on water. Once the writing was done, he would set down the pen, close the book, and extinguish the candle beside him. The darkness filled the room instantly, complete but not cold. Outside, the wind hummed softly, carrying the scent of the sea. That scent, faint and clean, seemed to wrap itself around him as he lay down to rest. Sleep came easily most nights. Not the restless sleep of command, not the shallow doze of battlefields, but deep, undisturbed rest. The kind of sleep that belongs only to those who have stopped running from themselves. For hours, the house remained still, and even the sea seemed to quiet its voice, as though giving him space to dream. Sometimes, he would dream of home, of France, of his family, of wide streets filled with morning light. In those dreams, he wasn't a general or a ruler, just a man walking among familiar faces. When he woke, there was no pain in the loss of the dream, only gratitude for having seen it again. Morning would return the same way it always did, a thin grey light seeping through the shutters, the quiet sound of servants moving about, and the steady hum of the island beyond. Napoleon would rise, dress, and begin again. Another day, another rhythm, another quiet unfolding of time. His attendants noticed how calm he had become. He spoke more gently, smiled more easily. The sharpness that had once defined him had softened into something contemplative. He had not changed who he was, only how he existed. The power that once ruled others now ruled only himself. On some evenings, when he felt strong enough, he would sit by the fire instead of going to bed early. The flames danced in the grate, warm and alive. He would hold his hands close, feeling the heat, and watch as the wood glowed red before fading into ash. He once said quietly, almost to himself, "Everything ends, but not everything is lost." The others said nothing, sensing that this was not meant as sadness, but as truth. If you're still awake, take another slow breath. Imagine that same glow, the gentle light, the warmth of the fire, the sound of calm air around you. This was his world now. No longer the battlefield, no longer the palace, just the slow, kind pulse of ordinary life. The nights at Longwood always ended the same way. The candles went out one by one. The footsteps faded. The sea continued its endless rhythm beyond the cliffs. And in that quiet, Napoleon's story rested, not as triumph or defeat, but as stillness, as peace. He would sleep deeply, his breathing even, his body at ease. Outside, the moon hung low, washing the island in silver. The world was vast again, untouchable, and he, who once tried to master it, now belonged simply to the night. If your eyes are closing, let them close fully now. The routine has done its work, for him and for you. Every sound has softened, every thought has slowed. The world is quiet once more, and in that quiet, rest waits, patient, steady, kind. There were moments, especially in the long afternoons, when the past returned to him like the slow drift of clouds across the sky. Napoleon would sit by the window, the light of Saint Helena stretching pale across the floor, and his mind would wander through time. Not to relive the glory, but to remember the feeling. The pulse of life that once moved so loudly, now softened into memory. He thought often of Austerlitz. The mist that morning, the sun cutting through the fog, the sound of his soldiers cheering as the battle unfolded exactly as he had imagined. He could still see the faces, tired, determined, young. For a moment, in that recollection, he could almost hear the echo of drums beneath the quiet rhythm of rain on the island roof. The memory didn't bring pride, not anymore. It brought stillness. Every triumph, he realized, had been temporary, every celebration followed by silence. The world had moved, and so had he, carried by time to this quiet hill where no battles waited and no orders mattered. He felt no bitterness in that thought, only a strange peace, as though the story had written itself to a natural end. Sometimes he would close his eyes and see the banners, the bright flags of France against a winter sky, the sound of the wind, the clash of steel, the distant thunder of cannon. It was a world of motion and fire, and yet, from this distance, it felt almost unreal, like a painting remembered from a dream. His companions would notice his faraway gaze and say nothing. They knew where he had gone, somewhere between memory and reverie, a place only he could walk. And when he returned, it was with the faintest smile, the kind that carried both pride and sadness in the same breath. He spoke rarely of victory. When he did, it was not to boast, but to observe. "Men follow fire," he once murmured softly, "but fire always burns itself out." No one replied. The wind through the open window seemed answer enough. If you're listening, let that sentence linger for a moment. It's a quiet truth, that even the brightest light must rest. Like a flame, it shines, it warms, it fades. History remembers, but the world itself moves on, softly, endlessly. Napoleon sometimes walked the perimeter of his small garden, imagining the borders of old campaigns beneath his feet. Each step carried an echo, not of conquest, but of understanding. The ground no longer trembled beneath him. The earth was steady now, as though forgiving. He found comfort in the smallest things, the curve of a leaf, the sound of distant waves, the warmth of tea between his hands. Where once he had sought the noise of crowds, he now preferred the quiet company of the ordinary. The simplicity felt honest, untouched by ambition. At dusk, when the light turned amber, He often stood by the door and watched the island breathe. The sea shimmered below, the air grew cooler, and the day's final breeze brushed gently through the grass. He would take a long, slow breath, letting it fill his chest, then release it with the ease of someone who had finally stopped resisting time. Inside, the house waited, calm, unchanged. Papers on the desk, a book left open, a candle half burned. These small signs of life had replaced the maps and plans that once covered his tables. The man who once ruled by action now lived by reflection. When he looked at his hands, he saw the marks of age, faint lines, thin veins beneath pale skin. Hands that had held power now trembled slightly as they held a cup or turned a page. He didn't hide them. He simply watched them, as one studies a familiar landscape under new light. If your breathing has slowed, stay with it. This is the rhythm of quiet realization, the same calm that filled his evenings when memories rose like gentle waves and receded without struggle. Let the stillness hold you as the past held him, soft, patient, without demand. Sometimes, he spoke to his attendants about the roads of Europe, the cities, the people, the endless travel. His words were slow, his tone gentle. Every place, he once said, has its own silence. He paused then, as though listening for Saint Helena's version of that silence, already woven around him. At night, the glow of the lamp brushed across his face, and the room felt larger than it really was. Shadows stretched like old friends along the walls. The memories came and went freely now, no longer sharp or heavy, but softened, like stones worn smooth by years of water. He was no longer haunted by what he'd lost. Instead, he carried it quietly, like a folded letter kept close to the heart. The battles, the cities, the faces, they had become stories, and the stories had become peace. And as the sea murmured below, and the candlelight flickered against the wooden walls, Napoleon's reflections felt less like recollection and more like prayer, not spoken aloud, but whispered within the stillness of his own mind. As the days passed, the memories visited more gently. They no longer arrived with sharp emotion, but with a softness that felt like forgiveness. Napoleon would sit quietly, his eyes half closed, and let the images flow. Battles, marches, faces, voices, each one fading in and out like the tide. The noise of his past had become music now, distant but tender, a rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. He thought of the soldiers who had followed him, men who had crossed mountains and rivers, who had believed in him with unshakable faith. He remembered their laughter, their songs around campfires, their steady eyes before dawn. The thought did not bring sorrow, but gratitude. He whispered once, almost to himself, "They gave me more than I ever gave them." Sometimes he would take out an old medal, turning it slowly in his hand. The metal had dulled with time, but the weight was still the same. He traced the edges with his thumb, remembering the ceremonies, the cheering crowds, the sense of purpose that once filled the air. Now, there was only the sound of the sea. The silence between those two worlds felt vast, yet peaceful. He no longer tried to separate pride from regret. Both had become part of the same memory, intertwined and inseparable. To remember was to accept. And in acceptance, he found the calm he had never known in power. The island had taught him that not every victory required applause. Some victories lived quietly, inside the heart. If your thoughts begin to slow, that's good. Let them. You're walking the same path he did, from noise to stillness, from ambition to reflection. Every breath brings you closer to the peace he found at the end of the world. In the early evenings, the light would fade slowly, stretching long shadows through his room. The sea below turned silver, and the horizon disappeared into the clouds. He often sat by the window at that hour, not to think, but to feel. The air was cool, the light soft, and for a few minutes, everything, past and present, felt perfectly balanced. There were times when he spoke of mistakes. He did so without bitterness, as though naming them was a kind of release. "A man cannot see the future," he said once, "but he can learn to see the truth in what has passed." His words hung in the air like smoke, light, fading, but real. At night, he would read passages from his favorite histories, tales of ancient leaders, philosophers, and poets. He no longer searched for lessons in them. He read them for their rhythm, their patience, their calm. They reminded him that every great story ends the same way, in silence, in memory, in rest. The candle beside him burned low, the flame trembling in the draught. It threw a warm glow across the papers on his desk, across his hands, and across the faint smile that sometimes appeared when he read something familiar. The world outside was asleep, and for once, so was the past. He would sometimes murmur fragments of his own speeches, half-forgotten words once shouted to thousands. Now they were whispered, slower, stripped of grandeur. The echoes of his voice filled only the small room, blending with the hum of the wind. He no longer needed an audience. He spoke only for himself, and that was enough. If you can feel the quiet around those words, hold it close. It's the same kind of stillness that fills a room after the last note of music fades. The story isn't over, but it's resting, waiting, breathing. There were moments when he would smile suddenly, perhaps remembering a joke from long ago, or the way sunlight once fell on a battlefield before the noise began. These memories no longer hurt. They comforted. The distance had made them kind. His attendants noticed how gentle he had become. His temper, once sharp, had softened into patience. His voice, once commanding, had turned thoughtful. The weight of his past no longer bent him. It balanced him. The empire that had once surrounded him was now contained within quiet words and quiet breaths. Each night, before sleep, he looked toward the faint light of the moon outside his window. The same moon, he knew, was shining over France, over all the places he had once known. That thought connected him to the world again, not through conquest, but through peace. He whispered once, "The world is smaller than I thought, and perhaps kinder." Then he closed his eyes, the candle flickering beside him, the room filled with calm. If your eyelids feel heavy, let them fall. You're resting now where he rested, in the gentle rhythm of waves and memory. The sound of the sea outside his window was the same that lulls you tonight. The same voice of time, speaking softly, reminding both emperor and listener that every story, no matter how grand, ends in quiet peace. And as the night deepened over Saint Helena, and the island breathed under the stars, Napoleon sat still one last time before sleep. His reflections no longer belonged to history. They belonged to the silence, patient, endless, and kind. Life on Saint Helena was not entirely lonely. Around Napoleon lived a small circle of companions, a handful of men and women who had followed him into exile, choosing distance and hardship over comfort. They filled the quiet house with movement, the soft shuffle of boots, the murmur of conversation, the gentle clatter of teacups. Their presence gave the island a rhythm that kept it from turning into silence completely. Each companion had once served him in brighter days. Some had been officers, others secretaries or attendants. Here, their ranks no longer mattered. They shared the same meals, the same grey weather, the same shrinking horizon. What had begun as duty slowly became devotion, not to an emperor, but to a man learning how to fade with dignity. In the mornings, they gathered in the dining room, the air smelling faintly of coffee and damp wood. Napoleon would greet them with a nod, sometimes with a small smile that lasted only a second. They discussed simple things, letters that had arrived, the condition of the garden, news from passing ships. The conversations were brief, but each word carried the weight of companionship. The island's isolation made them depend on one another. When storms came, they checked the shutters together. When supplies ran low, they shared without complaint. Even the British guards, once suspicious, learned to respect their quiet discipline. Life had narrowed to the essentials: warmth, food, company, and the soft passing of time. Sometimes, one of his companions would read aloud. Their voices filled the damp air with poetry, philosophy, and stories of faraway lands. Napoleon listened closely, his head tilted slightly, as if following a sound that connected him to a world beyond the sea. When the reader finished, he would often sit in silence for a while before murmuring, "Again." If you imagine that moment now, you can almost hear it, the soft tone of a human voice, the rain whispering on the roof, the distant sea breathing against the cliffs. It's the kind of sound that quiets the mind, that slows the heartbeat. The kind of sound that makes both history and sleep feel very near. Afternoons brought work. His aides helped him dictate his memoirs, the pages piling up in careful stacks. He spoke slowly, choosing each word with precision. His tone was calm, detached, sometimes even tender when he spoke of his soldiers or his family. Those sessions were not for pride, but for remembrance, the final way he could shape the story that would outlive him. When he grew tired, they would stop. One of them would pour tea, and they'd sit together near the window. The air smelled faintly of paper and salt. Outside, the fog drifted like smoke, blurring the edge of the world. It was in these pauses that they were most human, a small gathering of souls holding on to warmth while the wind brushed gently past the walls. In the evenings, they shared quiet laughter. Someone might recall an old campaign or a foolish story from the road, and for a brief moment, the years seemed to melt away. Even Napoleon laughed then, a soft, short sound, but real. For those who love him, that sound was enough to make the whole island feel alive. They celebrated small things, a letter from home, a clear sunrise, the arrival of fruit from a passing ship. These moments, trivial in another life, became treasures here. Gratitude had replaced grandeur. The greatness of empire had turned into the gentleness of shared days. At night, when the lamps were dimmed, his companions would retreat to their rooms. The hallways grew quiet except for the sigh of wind through the cracks. Sometimes, one would pause at Napoleon's door, hearing the faint rustle of pages inside. He was usually still awake, reading or writing, his candle flickering softly in the dark. If your thoughts have slowed with this image, let them rest. The world outside grows dimmer now, just as it did on that island. The companionship of those quiet souls, their soft voices and patient presence, is the same comfort that now surrounds you. The next morning always began the same way. Footsteps in the hall, the smell of tea, the soft scrape of chairs. They would greet each other with nods and calm smiles, as though beginning another verse of the same gentle song. Nothing grand ever happened, yet in their shared routine lay a kind of grace, a reminder that peace is often found in repetition. Napoleon treated them with kindness. The sharpness that once defined him had mellowed into warmth. He asked about their health, their families, their dreams. To them, he was no longer just their leader, but something smaller and truer, a man they understood, whose humanity they had come to love more than his legend. Sometimes, when the evening stretched long and quiet, he would thank them. Simply, sincerely, "You've stayed," he would say, "when you could have left." And one of them might answer, "We came for glory, but we stayed for peace." He said nothing after that, but his silence carried meaning deeper than any speech. The candlelight flickered between them, and for a brief moment, the emperor and his companions were equals, sharing not history, but humanity. Over time, the bond among them deepened into something quiet but strong. They no longer needed grand words or reminders of loyalty. Their companionship existed in glances, gestures, and shared silences. It was in the way one would refill another's cup without being asked, or how they walked together through the garden when the sky turned grey. Theirs was a friendship shaped by endurance, not excitement, one that rested gently within the slow rhythm of exile. Sometimes, on clear days, they would gather outside, sitting on rough wooden benches overlooking the ocean. The sun would hang low, warm against their faces, and the wind would tug at their coats. Conversation drifted lazily between them, rising and fading like the waves below. They spoke of home, of the food they missed, of the people they hoped still remembered them. Napoleon listened more than he spoke, content just to hear the voices of those who had stayed. In those moments, there was laughter again, soft, genuine laughter that rolled through the air like music. Even the guards nearby, usually stern and watchful, would sometimes smile. It was as though the island itself had softened, warmed by their small, shared humanity. The ocean, the cliffs, the grass, all seemed to breathe a little lighter when they did. When evening fell, the group often lingered outside a little longer, watching the sky darken into deep shades of blue. The stars above Saint Helena were impossibly clear, scattered like silver dust. Napoleon would tilt his head back to look at them, silent for a long while. Finally, he would murmur something so soft that only those closest could hear, a memory, a thought, or perhaps just a sigh. The younger ones among them saw him not as a fallen ruler, but as a teacher. His calm, his patience, his quiet way of reflecting on the world left an impression deeper than his victories. They saw in him the wisdom that comes after noise, the peace that follows the storm. And though none said it aloud, they knew they would remember him not for what he conquered, but for how he had learned to be still. If your breathing has slowed with theirs, that's perfect. You're walking the same quiet path, the same rhythm of soft voices, calm wind, and fading light. Let it wash over you gently, as though you, too, are sitting by that sea. When storms swept across the island, the companions gathered indoors, listening to the wind rush against the shutters. The candles flickered, their flames bending low, and the sound of rain filled the small house like music. They would sit together, close but silent, the warmth of presence stronger than words. For Napoleon, those were the moments that reminded him of what truly mattered. Not power, not history, but the simple comfort of being among others who understood. Sometimes he would ask one of them to play a quiet tune on a small instrument they had brought from home. The notes were delicate, trembling, like the island's own voice joining theirs. Napoleon closed his eyes then, resting his head back, and for a while, the room seemed to breathe in unison, a soft harmony of sound, wind, and memory. He often spoke less as the nights grew longer. The island had taken from him the need to lead, to command, to argue. His companions spoke for him when words were needed, and he answered with a look, a nod, or a quiet smile. The silence between them had grown so full it no longer felt empty. It was understanding, wordless, and deep. On rare occasions, illness or fatigue confined him to bed. His companions took turns keeping watch, reading softly, or tending to the fire. They moved gently, their voices hushed. Even in weakness, he carried a calm dignity that filled the room. He would sometimes whisper, "You should rest," and they would smile, knowing he never meant it. If you can feel that stillness now, let it settle in you. This is what true peace sounds like, not the absence of sound, but the presence of calm hearts. When his strength returned, he thanked them, every one of them, for staying, for giving their days to a man the world had already left behind. "You've shared my silence," he said once, "and that is more than I ever expected." The words hung in the air, soft but eternal in meaning. The companionship continued like this for years, woven with routines, shared stories, and the rhythm of the island. No one spoke of leaving anymore. The island had become their small universe, one of still mornings, quiet meals, and star-filled nights. Together, they built a kind of peace that no empire could create. Each evening ended with the same ritual. They would stand together for a final look at the horizon before parting ways. The wind carried the smell of salt and grass, and the sound of the sea murmured below like a lullaby. Napoleon lingered a little longer, his gaze following the last light of dusk. Inside, the candles glowed softly, waiting. His companions passed through the hall one by one, each offering a small nod before retiring. The house grew quiet again, but never empty. The presence of those loyal hearts lingered in every room, in every whisper of wind through the walls. And as he finally sat alone in the dim glow of evening, Napoleon closed his eyes, not to remember, but to rest. Around him, the island slept, the sea kept its rhythm, and his companions, faithful to the end, dreamed nearby, their lives forever woven into the story of a man who had once commanded the world, and now simply shared the silence. If your eyes are closing, let them. The sound of this moment, gentle, slow, and steady, is the same that carried through Longwood on nights like these. Companionship, quietness, and peace. That was all that remained, and perhaps all that was ever needed. Time began to move differently for Napoleon. The days no longer felt separate. They flowed into one another like the tide, slow and quiet. The air on Saint Helena had grown heavier, the wind cooler, and his step slower. Even the smallest movements now carried a weight that reminded him that strength, like power, fades softly before it disappears. He noticed it first in his walks. The path through the garden that once gave him comfort now felt longer. The hill that led to the sea's edge seemed steeper. He would stop halfway, resting his hand against the railing, letting the wind pass over his face. He didn't resent it. The slowing of his body was simply nature reclaiming its rhythm, steady, inevitable, and kind. Each morning, his companions waited to see if he would emerge. Some days he did, moving carefully, wrapped in a thick coat. Other days, he stayed inside, seated near the window where he could still see the pale shimmer of light on the ocean. The world beyond remained beautiful, even when it felt far away. His appetite waned. Meals became smaller, slower. He would take only a few bites, sip tea, and smile faintly when his attendants urged him to eat more. "The sea feeds me now," he would say, half in jest, half in truth. They never pressed him. The humor was fragile, like the man himself. If you can picture him there, seated by the window, the light spilling gently across his table, let that image stay with you. The sound of the wind through the trees, the steady rhythm of waves far below. It was peaceful, not tragic. A stillness earned after years of motion. His doctors visited often, their footsteps echoing down the narrow hall. They spoke in low tones, carrying their instruments with care. Napoleon greeted them politely, though he knew they could offer little more than observation. "You can't cure time," he once said quietly, "and time is the only thing that truly conquers." The dampness of the island often settled in his lungs. Some nights he coughed until dawn, his breathing rough and uneven. His attendants would stay near, offering water or quietly stoking the fire. Between the fits of coughing, he would rest in silence, his eyes fixed on the ceiling. When the pain passed, he would whisper, "It's nothing," though everyone knew it was something, the slow, gentle unraveling of a life once full of thunder. On calmer days, he would ask for his chair to be moved closer to the window. From there, he could watch the garden sway in the breeze. Birds flitted between branches, their calls faint but bright. He would smile at them sometimes, a small, almost invisible gesture, as if the world had offered him one final kindness. Afternoons grew shorter, nights longer. The candlelight stretched farther across the room, its glow reflecting softly in his tired eyes. He still kept his books nearby, though he no longer read for long. Sometimes he would rest his hand on the cover and close his eyes, as though the memory of words was enough. If your breathing is slow now, stay with it. This part of the story isn't sadness, it's surrender. The calm kind, the peaceful kind, the kind that comes when one stops fighting against time and begins listening to it instead. The island's weather matched his condition, unpredictable, shifting from sun to rain within the hour. On bright mornings, the whole world seemed clear again. On grey ones, fog rolled in thick and low, wrapping Longwood House in a quiet cocoon. Both kinds of days suited him. "I have seen the world," he once said softly. "Now I prefer the clouds." His attendants began to write for him more often. Dictation had grown tiring, and the quill felt heavier in his hand. Still, his mind stayed sharp. When he spoke, his words were measured, thoughtful, tinged with a calm humor that surprised those around him. The storm of his youth had softened into the gentlest rain. In the evenings, the house glowed with a fragile warmth. Candles burned in corners, and the air carried the faint scent of medicine and ink. The sound of the sea came through the open window, blending with the soft rhythm of his breathing. His companions often sat nearby without speaking, simply being there. Sometimes he would break the silence with a quiet question. "Do you think they still remember me in France?" One of them would answer carefully, "Of course, sire. How could they not?" He would smile, not in pride, but in gratitude. "Then that is enough," he would say. "Memory is the last empire." If you feel your mind softening with the rhythm of his words, that's good. You are following the same slow descent he did, not into loss, but into gentleness. The body rests, the heart quiets, the world keeps breathing. Nothing is lost, Everything simply changes its shape. At dusk, the light outside dimmed into a golden haze. Napoleon would sometimes ask for the shutters to remain open, wanting to see the color of the sea before night arrived. The horizon glowed faintly, the same shade he remembered from his victories, but now it brought peace instead of pride. He spoke less as the days grew shorter. The silence around him was no longer something to fill, it was something to cherish. His companions understood. They no longer asked questions, no longer tried to cheer him. They stayed close, their presence a quiet promise that he was never alone. And when the rain began again, steady and soft against the roof, he would lean back, eyes half closed, and listen. The sound filled the room, the same as it always had, the same as it does now, wherever you are. It was the sound of the world continuing, gentle and unhurried, long after the noise of history fades. As the months slipped away, the air inside Longwood grew quieter. Footsteps softened, conversation shortened, and the house itself seemed to hold its breath. Time had become a companion rather than an enemy. Napoleon no longer counted days. He simply existed within them, as though each sunrise was both a beginning and an end. His strength faded gently, like a candle burning low. He moved slower, spoke less, and spent most of his hours near the window or the fire. The ocean remained his constant view, endless, calm, and always moving. He often stared at it for long stretches without a word, the same way one might listen to music without needing to understand it. The sea had become his final battlefield, though this one asked for no victory, only peace. Some mornings, he would wake early enough to catch the first light touching the waves. The horizon glowed in shades of silver and pale blue, and the birds began their quiet songs. He would whisper softly, "Another day," as if surprised it had come again. Those who cared for him learned to treasure that phrase, not because of what it meant, but because of the calm way he said it. When his illness worsened, his companions stayed close. They spoke to him in soft tones, their words simple and warm. They no longer called him emperor all the time. Sometimes they said sir, or just his name, and he seemed to prefer it that way. There was comfort in the ordinary, a gentleness that no title could offer. If your breathing is deep now, let it stay there. The same quiet rhythm filled Longwood during those days, slow, steady, alive. This isn't a story of loss anymore. It's the story of stillness, of a man learning to rest after a lifetime of motion. On some evenings, when the pain grew sharp, he would close his eyes and whisper a few words in French, too soft for anyone to catch. They were not orders, not regrets, just fragments of thought, drifting like leaves across water. His attendants would bow their heads and listen to the silence that followed. It always felt sacred, though no one could explain why. The island seemed to grow gentler around him, as though the land itself understood. The wind lost its harshness, the sea quieted its roar, and even the birds flew lower, their song softer. Nature had taken him back into its rhythm, and in that rhythm, he found the peace he had once sought through force. The doctor came more often now, his visits filled with careful touches and quiet sighs. Each remedy brought brief relief, but the decline continued, steady, inevitable, and serene. Napoleon didn't resist. He spoke less of pain and more of comfort, thanking those around him with nods and half-smiles. When his strength allowed, he still asked to be dressed properly each morning. His jacket, his boots polished, his hair combed. Not out of vanity, but out of respect, for life itself, for the order that had once defined him. Even in weakness, he maintained dignity, a final echo of the discipline that had carried him through every chapter before this one. If you can imagine it now, picture the room filled with soft light, the faint scent of medicine and sea air, and the sound of slow breathing. It was the sound of the world growing quiet around him, not out of sadness, but out of love. In those final weeks, he spoke often of France, not of power or politics, but of landscapes, rivers, and morning light. The air there, he murmured once, was always sweeter than anywhere else. No one corrected him. They simply let him remember. Memory had become his final home. Some nights he dreamed aloud. His attendants heard him muttering softly, names, places, distant moments. But his tone was gentle, almost peaceful, as if he was speaking not to ghosts, but to friends waiting beyond the horizon. On one quiet morning, the wind outside stilled completely. The sea was calm, the sky pale and clean. Napoleon rested with his eyes closed, his breathing faint but steady. His companion stood nearby, silent. A single candle flickered on the bedside table, its flame barely moving in the still air. He opened his eyes one last time and looked toward the window. The ocean shimmered faintly beyond the glass. His lips moved, though no one heard the words. It might have been a memory, a farewell, or simply a sigh of relief. Then his eyes closed again, slowly, naturally, like a man falling into deep sleep. The candle burned until morning, its light soft against the quiet room. Outside, the wind began again, carrying the scent of rain over the island. The sea continued its endless motion, as if nothing had ended at all. And perhaps, in a way, nothing had. If your eyes are closing now, let them. This is the sound of rest, the same rest that filled that room so long ago. The waves still move, the night still breathes, and the story, like the man himself, has found peace. And somewhere far away, the ocean still carries his name, not as an echo of war, but as a whisper of calm. The world turned on, and the island slept, while the sea, steady and eternal by the will of the Almighty, kept singing its soft, endless song. The final evening came quietly, without announcement, without ceremony. There were no storms on the horizon, no wind against the windows, only the gentle hum of the island breathing through the dusk. The light fell softly across the floor of Longwood House, turning everything gold for a brief moment before fading into grey. It was a peaceful kind of ending, the sort that arrives not with noise, but with acceptance. Napoleon sat in his chair near the window, wrapped in a blanket. The air was cool and still, carrying the scent of rain that had passed earlier that afternoon. He watched as the sky shifted from pale amber to deep blue. The horizon glowed faintly, like the last ember of a dying fire. He didn't speak for a long time. He simply looked, as though trying to memorize the color of the world one final time. Napoleon's breathing was shallow, but steady. His eyes moved slowly from one familiar thing to another, the old book stacked on the desk, the clock ticking faintly on the shelf, the candle flames that trembled slightly whenever someone crossed the room. Everything he had left was here, in this single space. And in that realization, there was no sorrow, only peace. If you listen closely, imagine that quiet now. The soft flicker of candlelight, the steady rhythm of breath, the distant sigh of the ocean beyond the walls. This was the world in its gentlest form, stripped of noise, filled with stillness, held together by care. One of his attendants approached and asked softly if he wished to rest. He shook his head faintly, a small smile touching his lips. "Not yet," he whispered. "The night is beautiful." His voice was fragile, like wind brushing over glass, but the warmth in it remained. For a few more moments, he wanted to watch the sea. They adjusted his chair slightly so he could see the view more clearly. The sky had darkened now, the stars beginning to appear, scattered and cold above the ocean. The waves reflected their light, moving like silk under the moon. He exhaled slowly, as though the sight itself had carried him somewhere familiar. For a while, the others stood back, giving him space. They spoke in whispers, preparing his bed, tidying the desk. Their movements were slow, deliberate, an unspoken ritual of farewell. Outside, the island was silent except for the faint murmur of wind through the grass. It felt as if even the earth itself was listening. Napoleon's mind wandered, as it often did in these hours. He thought of his mother's face, of his brothers, of the scent of Corsican summers when the air was heavy with wild herbs. He thought of the roar of Paris, of laughter in marble halls, of the cold breath of winter battles. Yet all those memories came not with longing, but with gratitude. His voice, barely audible, whispered, "How full the world has been." If you feel your own breathing matching his pace, slow, calm, fading into the rhythm of the night, that's how it's meant to be. This is not a story of sorrow. It's a story of release, of the soul loosening its hold on time, and of the quiet beauty found in the final moments of stillness. The candle beside him had burned low, its light soft and amber. Shadows trembled gently along the walls, stretching like memories across time. His eyes followed the flame for a moment, then lifted again to the stars. "They look closer tonight," he said softly. No one answered. They didn't need to. Some truths are spoken only to the quiet. His doctor stepped forward, checking his pulse, his temperature, the faint rise of his chest. There was nothing more to do, only to stay. Napoleon noticed the look in his eyes and gave a faint nod, as if to say, "It's all right." The doctor bowed his head. As the night deepened, one of his attendants began to read softly from a book, a passage about home, about peace, about the turning of the seasons. The words filled the room like a lullaby, weaving around the flicker of candlelight and the whisper of the ocean outside. Napoleon closed his eyes, listening, his breathing slowing, his face calm. For a few moments, he drifted between waking and rest, the sound of the waves mixing with the rhythm of the words. The story ended, but the silence that followed carried its own meaning. In that stillness, everything felt suspended. The air, the time, even the heartbeats in the room. He opened his eyes once more and turned to his companions. "You've done well," he said softly, his tone full of gratitude. "Stay strong when I sleep." They nodded, tears in their eyes, though none fell. There was peace in his voice, a peace that came not from conquest, but from surrender. "If your eyes are heavy now, let them drift closed. You're resting in the same calm he found on that last evening, the rhythm of the sea, the warmth of light, the hush of time. The story moves slower now, softer, like the breath of a candle before it fades. And as the moon rose high above Saint Helena, the island seemed to glow, not in mourning, but in quiet understanding. The world had turned gentle again. The night held its peace, and within it, one man sat in the fading light, ready at last to let the tide carry him home. The moon climbed higher, casting a silver glow over Longwood House. Its light slipped gently through the window and across the wooden floor, glimmering on the folds of Napoleon's blanket. The air felt still, but not heavy, as though the island itself had settled into reverence. Every sound, every breath, carried meaning in its quietness. His companions stayed close but spoke no more. Words were no longer needed. Their faces were soft in the candlelight, calm but alert, like guardians of the night. Napoleon's breathing grew shallower, but each breath came with the same grace he had carried all his life. There was no struggle, no fear, only a slow fading of strength into serenity. He turned his head slightly toward the sound of the sea outside. The waves moved in a steady rhythm, as though they, too, were breathing with him. The scent of salt and cool air filled the room, blending with the faint aroma of wax and paper. Everything seemed in balance: earth, air, light, and time, all moving together in harmony. If you can feel that rhythm now, let it settle around you. The sound of the sea, the hush of night, the gentle breath of someone at peace. These are not the sounds of an ending. They are the sounds of return. One of his attendants reached forward and adjusted the blanket over his shoulders. Napoleon's eyes opened briefly, and he gave a faint smile. It was a look of recognition, of gratitude, of release. He whispered something inaudible, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a name. Then his gaze returned to the window and the glowing horizon beyond it. The stars were bright, scattered across the dark expanse like small promises. He stared at them for a long while, his lips moving slightly, as though speaking to the silence itself. No one interrupted. Every person in the room could feel that this was not a moment to be broken. The doctor kept watch quietly, counting the rhythm of each breath. Beside him, the attendants stood with bowed heads. The candles flickered lower, their flames bending as though moved by the soft exhale of the ocean breeze. Everything seemed to lean toward stillness. Outside, the wind shifted. The tall grass along the cliffs swayed gently, whispering against the stones. The night carried that sound into the house, a slow, soothing pulse, steady and eternal by the will of the Almighty. Napoleon listened, his eyes unfocused but peaceful. He had always listened to movement, of armies, of nations, of the world itself. But now, he listened to quiet. If your breathing has slowed again, you're right where you should be. This is the rhythm of peace, the same rhythm that filled that small room so long ago. The end of noise, the beginning of stillness. Napoleon's hand rested lightly on the arm of his chair. His fingers moved once, then grew still. His expression was calm, his face softened by the light. For a brief moment, the candle flame beside him trembled, as if bowing in farewell. Then the room seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke. The doctor lowered his head. One of the attendants stepped forward and quietly closed the shutters to the night. The sound of the sea continued outside, unbroken, eternal. The candlelight flickered across the walls, steady and warm. Napoleon Bonaparte had taken his final rest. The man who once reshaped the world now belonged completely to its quiet. His companions remained beside him for a long time, saying nothing. The silence itself was their prayer, soft, endless, full of understanding. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close. The story has reached its gentlest point. The sea is calm. The night is endless. And somewhere, across time and distance, the wind that once brushed those island hills still moves through the world, carrying with it the whisper of peace. The candles burned lower, their light folding into shadow. The house sighed softly, its walls creaking like an old soul exhaling. Outside, dawn waited patiently beyond the horizon, ready to paint the sky again. But for now, the world was still, perfectly, beautifully still. Napoleon's journey had ended, but his calm remained. Not as legend, not as glory, but as a quiet lesson carried through time, that every storm, no matter how fierce, must one day find its silence. And in that silence, the soul finally rests. If you're listening to this now, breathe deeply and slowly. Let the last of this story wrap around you like a blanket. The ocean still moves, the stars still shine, and history sleeps softly tonight. Let yourself drift with it, safe, calm, and at peace. And so the night of Saint Helena faded into morning. The candles melted away, the sky turned pale, and the island stirred once more. But within that quiet house, the story had already found its ending, gentle, full, and still. The sound of the waves remained, the first song of a new day. Sleep now, as he did, not in sorrow, but in peace. The past is quiet, the sea is endless, and the night carries you home. Morning arrived quietly over Saint Helena. The first light touched the hills with a soft silver hue, and the sea below shimmered like glass. Longwood House stood still, wrapped in mist and silence. Inside, nothing had changed, and yet everything had. The air itself seemed to carry the weight of memory, gentle and full of meaning. The attendants moved slowly through the rooms, their footsteps hushed. They spoke in low voices, not from grief alone, but from respect. The house that had echoed with Napoleon's footsteps for years now held only the echo of peace. Every object, the desk, the books, the worn chair by the window, seemed frozen in time, carrying traces of a life that had finally come to rest. Outside, the British sentries stood at attention. They knew, though no bells had rung and no orders had been given. The news had passed quietly from one man to another, carried by whispers. The island, for once, was united in stillness. The wind itself seemed unwilling to disturb the calm. The doctor wrote his final notes with careful precision, his hand trembling slightly. He paused often, not out of sadness, but out of reverence. There was something sacred in the silence that followed each word he wrote, a sense that history itself was holding its breath. If you imagine that morning now, let the quiet fill your thoughts. The light rising over the ocean, the slow rhythm of footsteps, the world paused between night and day. It's the sound of an era ending, not with thunder, but with peace. Napoleon's companions gathered in the small room beside his bed. None of them spoke for a long while. Their eyes were tired, but calm. Some prayed silently, others simply watched the faint movement of the curtains as the wind passed through. They didn't need to say farewell, Their presence was farewell enough. One of them reached for the candle on the bedside table and gently snuffed it out. The thin trail of smoke curled upward, twisting softly before fading into the morning air. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment, it felt like the closing of a great book, one that the world had read for decades. If your breathing is steady now, keep it that way. This part of the story is about quiet endings, about how great moments fade, not with noise, but with grace. The British officers who had once guarded him came to pay their respects. They entered with their hats in their hands, their faces solemn. There was no triumph in their eyes, only humanity. They had watched him age, weaken, and finally rest. Now they bowed their heads, not before an emperor, but before a man who had met his end with dignity. Outside, the island's villagers gathered by the roads. They spoke softly of the man who had lived among them, who had once ruled a continent, and who had died in their midst. Some had seen him ride along the cliffs, others had sold him food or supplies. For them, he was not a conqueror or a prisoner. He was simply a man far from home. The sea below remained calm, reflecting the pale light of dawn. It was the same sea that had brought him here and would now carry word of his passing back to the world he once ruled. The waves seemed slower that morning, their rhythm gentler, as though the ocean itself mourned in silence. The flag that had flown above Longwood was lowered halfway, its fabric fluttering softly in the breeze. The guards stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the horizon. No shots were fired, no drums beat. The farewell was as simple as the life he had come to live, stripped of ceremony, filled with peace. If your eyes are growing heavy, let them rest on that image, the flag moving gently in the wind, the soft light on the sea, and the quiet hearts gathered around a man who had finally found rest. The world was moving forward again, but this small island remained still, a moment of calm in the turning of history. The companions who had shared his exile began their preparations. They cleaned his room with care, folded his clothes, and gathered the few objects he had kept close: a watch, a pen, a few letters tied with string. These were not treasures of empire, but simple pieces of a life lived in reflection. Each item carried a story, and each story ended here. Later that morning, the church bell on the far side of the island rang once. The sound drifted through the mist, low and clear, echoing across the cliffs and the quiet water. It was not loud or mournful. It was steady, reverent, like a heartbeat continuing after the body has stopped. The people of Saint Helena paused in their work to listen. Farmers in the fields, sailors by the shore, even the children playing near the road, all stopped for that single moment of sound. It was as if the island itself was saying farewell, not to an emperor, but to the last echo of an age that had shaped the world. Inside Longwood, the candlelight faded as morning fully arrived. The windows filled with pale sunlight, washing the room in calm. The air was cool, but it carried warmth, the warmth of closure, of peace found at last. If you're still awake, breathe slowly. This is how all stories end, quietly, truthfully, in light. The noise fades, the pages close, and what remains is stillness, the final gift of time. News of Napoleon's passing began its long journey across the ocean. A ship left Saint Helena under a calm sky, its sails filled with steady wind. The crew spoke little. They knew the message they carried would echo through the world. The waves rolled softly beneath them, as if guarding the memory of the man who had once set entire nations in motion. Weeks later, the first reports reached Europe. At the harbours, messengers carried the news inland, and word spread through towns and cities like the slow turning of a great clock. Some heard it with disbelief, others with silence. A few raised their heads toward the horizon, remembering how his name had once filled every conversation, every fear, every hope. Now, it arrived only as a whisper, "He is gone." In Paris, the news moved quietly through narrow streets and wide boulevards. The people did not shout or weep. They simply paused. Shopkeepers stopped sweeping their doorways, soldiers lowered their voices, and the sound of carriages softened against the cobblestones. The city that had once cheered for him now stood still, as though listening to the last echo of his footsteps fade into memory. If you can imagine that stillness, let it settle around you. The calm of a city at dawn, the hush of a world realizing that history has turned a page. There is sadness, yes, but beneath it lies something gentler, the kind of peace that follows understanding. Across Europe, from Spain to Russia, the reaction was the same. The old soldiers who had marched under his banner removed their hats. In quiet corners of taverns and in the fields where they now worked, they bowed their heads for a moment and remembered. Not the wars, not the victories, but the faces of comrades who had never come home. Writers and poets began to speak of him again, but with a softer tone. No longer as the conqueror or the tyrant, but as the man who had lived too greatly for the time he was given. They wrote of the loneliness of his exile, of the calm that had replaced ambition, and of how even the strongest flame must dim. If your thoughts drift as you listen, let them. This part of the story is not about loss. It's about the way the world breathes after the storm, the calm that follows thunder, the stillness that teaches. The ship that had carried the news returned to the sea once more, sailing toward the far corners of empire. And everywhere it went, the waves repeated the same song, a soft rhythm that spoke of endings, of cycles, of rest. The ocean that had once separated him from the world now connected him to it again, carrying his memory across every shore. Years later, travelers would visit the island, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by reverence. They would walk the same narrow paths, touch the walls of Longwood House, and listen to the endless sound of the sea. Some said they could still feel the quiet there, the weight of time, the tenderness of solitude. The place had become a monument, not to power, but to reflection. Even those who had opposed him spoke of him with a kind of respect. They recognized in his life the full circle of human ambition, brilliance, rise, fall, and peace. He was mortal, one said softly, but his story reminds us how deeply a single life can shape the world before fading into it. If your eyes are heavy, you can let them close now. The story is moving toward its softest rhythm, like a lullaby played by the sea. The waves have carried the past away. Only calm remains. Decades later, his remains were returned to France, carried home across the same waters that had once held him prisoner. The journey was slow, solemn, and filled with quiet ceremony. When the ship entered the Seine, crowds lined the riverbanks in silence, watching the flag-draped coffin pass beneath a pale winter sky. The sound of bells echoed faintly over the water, not mournful, but steady, like a heartbeat reborn. In Paris, beneath the great dome built for kings, he was laid to rest. Candles burned in long rows, their light trembling in the air like a sea of stars. Outside, snow fell softly, blanketing the city in white. People gathered in silence, heads bowed, their breath misting in the cold. It was not a farewell to a ruler, but to an era that had finally gone to sleep. The world continued. Seasons changed, new leaders rose and fell, and time folded his story gently into history's vast tapestry. Yet somewhere, in the rhythm of every tide, in the march of every dawn, the memory of his final piece remained, quiet, patient, unending. If you listen closely, you can still hear it, the sound of the waves on Saint Helena, the hush of dawn over Paris, the calm that follows every storm. It's the same peace that fills your room now, wrapping around you like the softest blanket of night. Years passed, and the island of Saint Helena faded back into silence. The wind still moved over its cliffs, the waves still touched its shores, and the small house called Longwood stood like a memory made of wood and stone. Travelers came and went, whispering as they walked its narrow halls. They spoke softly, as though the walls could still hear. In that quiet place, history no longer shouted, it breathed. Napoleon's name drifted through time like a low current beneath the surface of the world. No longer a symbol of conquest or war, it became something gentler, a reminder of how even the brightest lives end in silence. His story had turned from noise to meaning, from battle to rest. Across centuries, people remembered not only what he had done, but how he had finished, calmly, with acceptance, surrounded by peace. The island became a place of reflection. Writers described it as a world apart, a dot on the map that held the weight of an empire's final sigh. Pilgrims came to stand by the grave under the willow trees, listening to the same wind that once carried his voice. They didn't speak of power there. They spoke of time, and of how all things, great and small, return to it. If you're still awake, breathe softly. You are standing in that same wind now. The sound that moves through the trees on Saint Helena is the same sound that moves through your quiet room. It's the rhythm of remembrance, slow, even, kind. As decades turned into centuries, his image changed again. Painters stopped painting him as the fierce commander. Instead, they showed the thoughtful man by the window, the exile looking toward the sea. The world seemed to understand at last that his final act was not in war, but in waiting, in patience, in stillness. Scholars studied his words, not his weapons. They found wisdom in his reflections, small truths hidden beneath layers of ambition. He had once shaped armies, now he shaped thought. In lecture halls and quiet libraries, his story lived again, not as legend, but as lesson. Every generation found something different in him. Some admired his will, others questioned his choices, but all seemed to pause at the same point, the end. The exile. The calm. That moment when a man who had once commanded the world finally looked out over the sea and saw something larger than himself. If your breathing has grown deeper, let it stay that way. You are moving with the same rhythm that time itself keeps, slow, patient, infinite. The same rhythm that turned his storms into quiet and his story into rest. In France, people began to visit his resting place not to mourn, but to think. The echo of footsteps in the marble hall, the soft murmur of visitors beneath the dome, it all carried a sense of reverence, not for glory, but for humanity. Children looked up at his statue, adults bowed their heads, and each left with the same thought. Even the greatest stories end in silence. The sea, always the keeper of his last years, became part of his legacy too. Sailors spoke of passing Saint Helena on clear nights, seeing the outline of the island beneath the stars. They said the air there felt different, lighter, calmer, as if the winds remembered a man who had finally learned to rest. He was no longer the man who sought to command the world. He had become part of the world itself, a chapter in its memory, a whisper in its rhythm. The once mighty emperor now belonged to the same peace that surrounds every life when the noise is gone. If you close your eyes, you might feel that same peace now. The stillness that holds every sound, the calm that waits beneath every storm. It's what history becomes when it stops speaking and simply listens. The name Napoleon no longer belongs only to power. It belongs to reflection, to the quiet that follows a life fully lived, to the realization that greatness is not measured by how loudly we live, but by how peacefully we learn to stop. As the centuries continued to turn, Napoleon's story became part of the Earth's quiet memory. His name drifted like mist across history, sometimes bright, sometimes faint, always present. People no longer spoke of him with fear or awe, but with calm curiosity. He had become what all stories eventually become, a lesson wrapped in silence. The world he once knew had changed entirely. Empires rose and fell again, new nations formed, and new dreams took the place of old ones. Yet, even as the world grew louder, his quiet end on that small island remained, a still point in the endless movement of time. The sound of the sea at Saint Helena had outlasted the sound of battle. That was his true legacy. Visitors still came to the island. They stood beneath the trees, the air heavy with salt and memory. Some whispered prayers, others said nothing at all. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying away their words before they reached the sea. The island did not answer. It simply listened, the same way it had listened to him. If you imagine it now, the distant ocean, the hush of leaves, the endless sky, you may feel the same calm that lingers there. It's the calm that follows understanding, the peace that comes when the story has nothing left to prove. In the quiet corners of libraries and classrooms, his name is still spoken softly, not to celebrate power, but to remember how power ends. Historians trace his journeys, artists study his eyes, philosophers quote his reflections. Yet beneath all of it lies a simple truth, that even the mightiest must learn to be still, and that stillness itself can be a kind of victory. The sea remains his monument. Every wave that touches the island's shore carries the same eternal rhythm. a reminder that life continues even after all has passed. The island's mornings are unchanged, the same wind, the same light, the same slow heartbeat of the ocean. It is as though time decided to preserve that calm forever, a living echo of peace. If you are still awake, breathe with that rhythm. Let the waves move through your thoughts and smooth them out. You are part of the same world he left behind, a world where silence teaches more than noise ever could. Napoleon's story is no longer just a tale of war or ambition. It's the story of what comes after, the soft, inevitable hum of peace that waits for everyone, no matter how far they've traveled or how loud they've lived. It's a story that reminds us that every ending, when met with grace, becomes a beginning again, in memory, in calm, in quiet. People often wonder what legacy truly means. It isn't statues or crowns, nor words carved into marble. It's the way a life continues to echo in stillness, the way someone's story can make others stop, breathe, and think more gently about their own. That is what remains when everything else has faded. If your eyelids are heavy now, let them close. You're resting in the same peace he found, the same peace that belongs to all who learn to let go of noise and return to calm. The waves still move, the stars still shine, and the wind still carries the same soft song of history across the sea. Longwood House still stands, its windows facing the endless horizon. On quiet nights, when the air is clear, you can almost imagine the faint sound of footsteps in its halls, the whisper of turning pages, the low hum of memory. But it's not sadness that lives there, it's serenity, the kind that asks for nothing but silence and gives everything in return. And so, his story settles, not on battlefields or thrones, but in the calm hearts of those who listen. History has folded him into its rhythm, where his name rests alongside the sound of the sea, eternal by the will of the Almighty. If you can feel that peace now, hold on to it. It belongs to you as much as it belonged to him. The same wind that brushed his face on Saint Helena moves through your night tonight. The same stillness that surrounded him can surround you too, if you simply let it. Now, take one more slow breath. Let the world outside fade away. You are safe. You are calm. And the story, like the tide, has reached its gentle shore. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for spending this quiet moment of history with me. May your night be peaceful, your dreams light, and your heart at ease. Sleep well, traveler. The past is quiet now. And so, at last, are you.